The lights in the New York studio were set to maximum brightness. Flags from multiple nations lined the background of the stage, creating a spectacle of international diplomacy. The show was promoted as Future Voices, Bridging Generations, a panel bringing together emerging world leaders and political heirs. The producers wanted controversy, and they were about to get it. At one side of the long mahogany table sat Ibrahim Traoré, dressed sharply in a charcoal suit. He sat still, upright, dignified, a man who'd known war, betrayal, and victory. His posture radiated calm command. Across from him was Barron Trump, taller than most on the panel, youthful, confident, and as smug as he was polished. At just 19, he had already begun speaking at international events, echoing his father's legacy. But it was clear from the moment the cameras started rolling, Barron didn't see Traoré as an equal. As a younger voice on this panel, Barron said into his mic, "I think we should stop pretending that dictators like Traoré are somehow liberators. You can put a suit on tyranny, but it's still tyranny." A murmur swept through the room. One of the moderators shifted nervously. Traoré didn't blink. He looked directly at Barron and leaned slightly forward, hands clasped. "I came here to discuss the future," he said calmly. "But you, son, came here to rehearse your father's script." Barron's eyebrows lifted. He smirked. "No disrespect, Mr. Traoré, but when you rule by force, you forfeit the right to talk about the future. Maybe where you're from, power is taken. Here, it's earned." Traoré paused. Then, with a measured breath, he leaned back in his chair, turned slightly toward Barron, and said in a voice that cut through the air like glass. "Sit down, kid. The adults are speaking." There was a pause, not the awkward kind, but the stunned kind. One panelist chuckled under his breath. A camera operator dropped something. Twitter was already exploding. Barron blinked, clearly unsure if he'd just been insulted, challenged, or both. The moderator tried to redirect. "Let's, return to the question of development aid and—" But Traoré raised a finger. "I'll answer that," he said, eyes still fixed on Barron. "But let's be clear. This panel isn't about grooming legacies. It's about confronting reality." And suddenly, the entire room was listening, not to the heir of an empire, but to the man who refused to bow to one. Barron Trump tried to smile, but the sharpness of Traoré's reply had already carved through his polished confidence. Cameras caught the tension in his jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in his otherwise practiced posture. The audience, both in studio and online, could sense the shift. The Prince of Privilege had miscalculated. "I don't need to sit down," Barron said, trying to regain control of the room. "I was invited here to speak, just like you." Traoré tilted his head. "And speak you did. Like a teenager who thinks the world began the day he was born." A few people chuckled. Even one of the American panelists, Senator Latham, pressed his lips together to hide a grin. Barron's cheeks flushed. "I've studied global politics. I know history. I don't need lectures from someone who censors the press and silences dissidents." Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "And yet here you are, repeating headlines like gospel. You've studied us through articles written by the people who own your airwaves. That's not knowledge. That's permissioned ignorance." The moderator jumped in, too late. "Let's keep this respectful." But Traoré was still calm. Respect starts with listening. Not lecturing someone who's fought for his country while you were, what? On TikTok? Barron leaned back, scoffing. "So now I'm just a kid with a phone." "No," Traoré replied smoothly. "You're a symbol. Not of evil. Of something more dangerous. Of the arrogance that comes when someone inherits power without understanding its price." The air shifted. Even the producers in the control booth were frozen, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let it burn. Caroline Levitt, sitting 2 seats down from Barron, tried to intervene. Let's not forget Mr. Traoré has a military background. He's trained in intimidation. Traoré turned his gaze to her. And yet here I am, speaking, not shooting. I came to build bridges. But if you hand me bricks soaked in condescension, don't be surprised if I throw one back. Silence. Barron glanced to his side, hoping for a life raft from his allies, but no one reached. He was on his own. His eyes darted to the camera, perhaps hoping his followers were still on his side. They weren't. On social media, hashtags were flipping. Hashtag Traoré clapped back and hashtag sitdownkid were already trending. Memes were flooding the feed. But more importantly, so were serious questions. Why did Barron think he could speak to a sitting president like that? Is this how the next American generation will lead, with smirks and soundbites? And in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré didn't just silence a Trump. He exposed something deeper, the hollowness of unearned confidence. For a full minute, no one said a word. The moderator cleared his throat again, this time with genuine discomfort. President Traoré, he said carefully, we understand your frustration, but surely you agree that. I'm not frustrated, Traoré said, still seated calmly. I'm focused. There's a difference. One builds nations. The other builds tweets. He glanced around the room, at Barron, at the other panelists, and finally, at the audience. I came here because I believed in this format. Because I was told it was about dialogue between generations. But let's be honest, some came here to posture. Others, to provoke. He turned back to Barron. But I'm not here to perform. I'm here because the world is on fire. And while you're rehearsing your father's legacy, my people are rebuilding from the ashes of someone else's. Barron tried again. You're acting like I don't know anything just because I'm young. Traoré didn't flinch. No. I'm saying that being young is not a shield from responsibility. Especially when your name gets you a microphone before your mind is ready to hold it. Somewhere in the back, a student clapped quietly. Then another. The moderator raised his hand to calm the noise, but the tide was turning. On the big screen behind them, live social media comments were scrolling. Traoré is speaking truth. That was brutal. But fair. Barron walked into a lion's den wearing a paper crown. The producer in the control room whispered into the moderator's earpiece, keep it going. Engagements through the roof. Meanwhile, Traoré leaned forward again, his tone softening. Look, I don't hate you, Barron. In fact, I understand you. You were born into a system that told you you'd always be at the center. That every room was yours. But here's the thing, this room, this world, is changing. And if you want to have a seat at the table, you can't walk in with your father's arrogance. You'll have to earn your own voice. Barron sat still. The smirk was gone. The camera caught something new in his face, uncertainty, maybe even reflection. Caroline Levitt leaned over and whispered something in his ear. But this time, Barron didn't respond. Because in that moment, he realized what had just happened, he had come to dominate the conversation, and ended up part of a masterclass. Traoré looked back to the moderator. Next question, please. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in respect. The moderator, finally regaining some composure, adjusted his tie and scrolled nervously through his tablet. Let's pivot, he said. Mr. Traoré, in your view, what is the biggest misconception Americans have about your leadership? Traoré didn't hesitate. That I'm a villain because I refuse to kneel. The room hushed again. Western narratives paint independence as hostility, he continued. When I expelled foreign troops from my soil, they called me unstable. When I nationalized our gold, they called me a thief. But when your corporations do the same in reverse, they call it economic policy. Barron shifted in his seat, but said nothing. You see, Traoré added, it's not that I broke the rules. It's that I rejected your rules. The ones written without our consent. One of the American analysts on the panel, Dr. Ellen Morse, spoke up. But isn't there value in international cooperation? Surely self-reliance doesn't mean isolation. Traoré nodded. Absolutely. I believe in partnership. But not in servitude. What's offered to us is often not partnership, it's dominance dressed as aid. Barron suddenly spoke again. Then what do you want from the West? What's your ideal relationship? Traoré turned to him. Respect. Nothing more. Nothing less. That one word landed harder than any speech. You want to trade? Trade fair. You want to help? Ask, don't impose. You want to speak? Then listen first. For the first time, Barron didn't have a retort. He looked down at his hands, then back at Traoré. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe I walked in here thinking I knew more than I do. Traoré gave him a measured nod. That's the beginning of wisdom, Barron, not knowing, but recognizing that you don't. Even the moderator seemed surprised at the turn. What had begun as a showdown was slowly turning into something else, a transformation. Live viewers across the globe were glued to their screens. The chat was blowing up. This is the real debate we needed. Traoré's not just a leader, he's a teacher. Barron's learning in real time, and honestly, it's humbling to watch. Back in the studio, the air no longer crackled with arrogance or ego. It simmered with something deeper, understanding. And as the next question rolled in, everyone knew. The conversation had just begun. A short break was announced in the live broadcast. Cameras panned out, mics muted, but the tension in the studio didn't fade. Staff buzzed around with quiet urgency, updating social feeds, adjusting lighting, whispering to each other, "This is going viral." Barron remained in his seat, uncharacteristically quiet. He scrolled his phone. Every platform was flooded with reactions. A meme of Traoré saying, "Sit down, kid," was trending. But surprisingly, so were thousands of comments praising Barron for not walking out. That surprised even him. "Are they respecting me for not clapping back?" he muttered. From across the table, Traoré noticed. "Leadership isn't about winning every exchange," he said calmly. "It's about learning when silence speaks louder than pride." Barron looked up. "How do you carry that? The way you speak, the way you just own the room?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "Because I buried friends in it." Barron blinked. "What?" Traoré leaned back. "I'm not standing here because I won a popularity contest. I stood between a militia and a school full of children once. I led a resistance movement with no guarantee of tomorrow. Power isn't a game where you level up. It's a burden." The room had fallen silent again, even off-air. Barron's earlier bravado dissolved entirely. He wasn't speaking to a debate opponent anymore. He was speaking to someone who'd earned every scar on his voice. "I guess I've never had to fight for anything," Barron admitted. "That's not your fault," Traoré replied. "But it becomes your responsibility the moment you realize it." A technician gave the 30-second countdown. The broadcast was about to resume. "Why didn't you humiliate me?" Barron asked suddenly. Traoré glanced at him. "Because then I'd be no different than what I oppose." When they went live again, the audience could feel the difference. Something had shifted. Not just in the debate, but in Barron himself. The next question from the moderator came slowly. "President Traoré, many have accused you of being too harsh, too uncompromising. What do you say to those who call you the Iron Wall of Africa?" Traoré didn't smile. He didn't posture. He simply said, "An iron wall only rises when too many try to break in through the back door." The question lingered in the air like thunder. An iron wall only rises when too many try to break in through the back door. The moderator blinked. The audience leaned forward. Even Barron looked stunned. But Traoré wasn't done. "You ask why I'm uncompromising," he said, turning toward the cameras. "Let me ask you this, why should I compromise with those who never asked for my opinion until I said no?" A pause. Compromise is only noble when both parties stand as equals. When one comes with a leash and the other with a backbone, that's not negotiation. That's colonization in a tailored suit. The panel was speechless. Not because they disagreed, but because no one had ever said it out loud like that, especially not on American television. Caroline Leavitt, seated at the far edge of the panel, finally broke the silence. "You sound like you don't believe in diplomacy." Traoré turned calmly. "I believe in diplomacy. But I don't believe in being patted on the head while signing away my country's future." Murmurs filled the crowd. Barron stared at him, but this time not as a challenger, as a student watching a master rewrite the syllabus mid-lecture. "You think this is just about politics?" Traoré continued. "This is about dignity. About whether people like me are allowed to speak without translation. About whether I can walk into this room and not be seen as an outsider, but as a man who earned his seat." He looked toward Barron again. "And I'm telling you now, I did earn it. With more blood than you'll see in a lifetime." The moderator tried to change course. "President Traoré, where does this end? This refusal to play by traditional rules, what does it achieve?" Traoré didn't blink. "It doesn't end," he said. "Because freedom has no finish line. It's something you guard every day, from enemies, from friends, even from history." The control room was in chaos. Viewer numbers had doubled in the last 10 minutes. Social media feeds exploded with quotes, reactions, fan art, hashtags like #TraoréSpeaksTruth and #SitDownKid were trending worldwide. And inside the studio, something rare had happened. The format had dissolved. The stage had shifted. The man once mocked as out of place now stood as the moral center of the room. Barron lowered his eyes. Even he knew it. During the commercial break, Barron leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice barely audible. "I didn't come here expecting to respect you." Traoré didn't flinch. He just looked at him. "But I do now," Barron said quietly. For the first time, Traoré gave him something like a smile. Not soft. Not sentimental. But earned. "You don't need to like me," Traoré said. "But you do need to understand the world doesn't revolve around your flag." Barron nodded, slowly. "That part, I'm still working on." "Good," Traoré replied. "That means you're waking up." When the broadcast returned, the room felt different. Even for the viewers. The audience wasn't watching a clash anymore. They were watching a young man be confronted with the weight of real leadership. Not inherited. Not branded. But forged. The next panelist, a journalist from the New York Times, asked, "President Traoré, some say you're too focused on the past. That your rejection of Western influence is rooted in old wounds. Why not let it go and focus on the future?" Traoré turned to her. "You don't bury a wound until it's healed. And ours still bleeds every time a foreign contract arrives with invisible ink." The journalist leaned in. "So you don't trust us?" "I trust intentions," Traoré said. "But I verify outcomes. And the outcomes, so far, have mostly benefited you." Barron jumped in again, surprising even the moderator. "But what if there is a way to work together? What if some of us want to build something real?" Traoré looked him straight in the eye. "Then stop speaking for us. And start listening to us." Another pause. Barron leaned back, thoughtful, even subdued. "Fair," he said. The moderator was speechless. So was the audience. For a brief moment, a flash of discomfort crossed Traoré's face, not because of Barron's words, but because of what came next. A security aide walked to the edge of the stage, whispering something into an earpiece. The moderator blinked. "We've just been informed," he said carefully, "that protests have erupted outside the studio, supporters and critics of President Traoré clashing." The cameras turned to Traoré, expecting a defensive response. But Traoré remained calm. "Let them protest," he said. "It means they're not asleep." The streets outside the studio were boiling with tension. One side chanted, "Stand with Traoré," waving handmade signs and flags. The other shouted, "American values first," accusing the African president of arrogance and anti-Western propaganda. News helicopters hovered overhead. Police had arrived. Cable networks cut into regular programming to broadcast the chaos live. Inside the studio, a heavy silence hung in the air. The moderator looked visibly unsettled. "Mr. Traoré, how do you respond to the division your presence has sparked, even here, on American soil?" Traoré didn't need time to think. "This division didn't start with me," he said, his voice steady. "It started the day some nations decided they were the authors of everyone else's story." He pointed toward the window, toward the unrest. "They're not angry because of who I am. They're angry because I don't flinch when they raise their voice. Because I remind them the world doesn't need permission from Washington to breathe." Barron glanced at the moderator. "Maybe we should ask ourselves why so many people who've never met him, either love him or hate him instantly." The moderator blinked. "And what do you think the answer is?" Barron hesitated. Then, with a self-aware smirk, "Maybe it's because he reminds them that some people earn their power, while the rest inherit it." The panel erupted, gasps, nervous laughter, shock. Even Traoré's eyes widened slightly. Barron had just turned the mirror on himself. The moderator scrambled. "Barron, do you regret saying that?" "No," he replied calmly. "Because it's true. And because sitting at this table tonight, I've realized something else. I talk about patriotism, but I've never risked anything for it." Traoré folded his arms, listening. "I've never buried a friend for it. Never missed a meal for it. Never had to prove I deserved a seat." He turned to Traoré again. "But you have." There was no applause. No music cue. Just silence, the kind that settles in a room when truth cuts deeper than anyone expected. Outside, the chants grew louder. Inside, the young man once mocked for being just a kid had finally grown into his own voice. And Traoré. He just nodded once, the faintest sign of approval. The moderator, flustered but composed, turned toward Traoré. "President Traoré, you've challenged nearly every assumption we hold about diplomacy, leadership, and power. But what's your ultimate goal in being here tonight? Why step into this lion's den?" Traoré leaned forward. His hands clasped on the table. His tone, softer now, but no less firm. "Because you cannot change a system from the outside if the doors remain closed," he said. "So I walked into this room to force it open." He scanned the panel. "You may not agree with me. You may not like how I speak. But tonight, you had to hear me. And whether you applaud or sneer, I've done what I came to do, remind this nation that leadership is not inherited, not rehearsed, it is lived." The audience was frozen. Even the most skeptical faces looked different now, like something uncomfortable but honest had taken root. Then, Barron, now noticeably more reserved, raised one last question. "What happens when the cameras turn off, and the world goes back to ignoring voices like yours?" Traoré turned to him and gave his most direct answer of the night. "Then I raise my voice louder." He stood up. But before leaving, he looked back at Barron one last time. "Don't mistake silence for surrender. Sometimes we go quiet just long enough to sharpen our words." Then he walked off stage. No dramatic music. No media frenzy at that moment. Just the sound of the audience rising, some slowly, some instantly, in a standing ovation. Backstage, the producer whispered to an assistant, "We just recorded the most important moment of the year." Outside, the protests still raged. But inside, something had shifted. And Barron Trump, once armed with talking points, now sat quietly, absorbing the reality that no script could have prepared him for. He turned to the moderator and muttered, "He didn't come here to win, he came here to teach." And teach, he did. 2 days later, the clip had circled the globe. On TikTok, millions lip-synced the phrase, "Sit down, kid." On CNN, analysts called it the moment Barron Trump grew up on camera. On Fox News, others called it an orchestrated embarrassment to American dignity. But outside the spin machines, something deeper was brewing, especially among the youth. In high school classrooms and college forums, students dissected Traoré's words like scripture. They weren't echoing him because he was powerful. They were echoing him because he'd said what others were afraid to. That power is not a birthright. It's a burden. One you must carry with integrity, not inheritance. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré's motorcade moved silently through dusty streets. He was greeted not by fanfare, but by children waving flags they had drawn themselves, red, green, and gold. He had come back from a battlefield with no guns. And yet, he had returned as if from war. In a quiet moment back at the presidential compound, an aide handed him a transcript of the debate. Traoré skimmed it. He smiled when he reached the line, "Don't mistake silence for surrender." The aide asked, "Was it worth it, Mr. President?" Traoré didn't answer right away. He looked out the window. Then he said, "Some rooms you enter to speak. Others, to remind them you were never gone." That night, as the world moved on to other headlines, a subtle shift lingered. Barron Trump, no longer the untouchable heir, had learned to listen. And Ibrahim Traoré, the man dismissed, ridiculed, and underestimated, had walked into a room built to shut him out, and left the door wide open. Not by shouting, but by standing still. And telling the truth. They thought they could corner him with mockery. They thought power came with a name, a suit, or a legacy. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't come to bow. He came to remind them that dignity can't be borrowed, and truth doesn't need permission. In that room, he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just stood. And in doing so, he shook the foundation of every assumption. Barron Trump walked in thinking he was the future. But he left realizing he'd just been schooled by it. Sometimes, the one who's underestimated is the one who rewrites the rules. And sometimes, the loudest silence belongs to the man who never flinched.